When the United States imposed steel tariffs on Canada, Ottawa did not answer with speeches, it answered with infrastructure. Canada backed a railway strategy worth billions of dollars, and that decision began changing the way trade moved across the continent. While the world focused on Washington, almost nobody was paying attention to Calgary. That quiet, calculated approach is often how major shifts begin. This is the story of one of the most expensive geopolitical moves Canada has ever made. Hit the subscribe button on Money Signals, because this story may completely change how you think about North American trade. On February 1, 2025, Donald Trump signed the orders. A 25% tariff was placed on goods entering from Canada, while Canadian energy and potash faced a 10% rate at the border. A bilateral trading relationship worth roughly $700 billion a year was suddenly under attack. Canada purchases more from the United States than the United Kingdom, France, China, and Japan combined. That figure is enormous. The relationship appeared impossible to replace, at least from Washington's point of view. Ottawa did not panic. The Canadian government had already been moving quietly behind the scenes. Its counter-tariffs took effect on March 4, 2025, beginning with a 25% duty on $30 billion worth of American products. Within 3 weeks, that total was expected to expand to $155 billion, but tariffs were only one part of the response. The other part was a railway, and not an ordinary one. It was the first single-line transnational rail network in North American history. In April 2023, Canadian Pacific completed its $31 billion purchase of Kansas City Southern. The deal had taken 2 years to finalize and had faced aggressive competition from the beginning. Canadian National entered the contest with a rival offer valued at $33.7 billion, but Canadian Pacific ultimately prevailed. The Surface Transportation Board approved the transaction in March 2023. On April 14, 2023, Canadian Pacific Kansas City, known as CPKC, officially came into existence. From that day forward, the map of North American freight was permanently changed. Here is what most people missed about that merger, and why it became so important once the trade conflict began. For the first time, one railway connected Canada, the United States, and Mexico through a single continuous network. Calgary and Mexico City were linked under one corporate system. CPKC now operates around 20,000 route miles of track across all 3 countries. It employs approximately 20,000 railway workers across that continental footprint. Its global headquarters are in Calgary, Alberta, while its Mexican operations are headquartered in Mexico City. The company generated about $14.2 billion in freight revenue during 2024. By 2025, that total had climbed further. In 2024, approximately 41% of CPKC's revenue came directly from cross-border traffic. That represented close to $6 billion a year tied to goods moving across international boundaries on its rail lines. Now, consider what happens when Washington begins using those same borders as instruments of tariff policy. CPKC Chief Executive Keith Creel did not wait for the damage to arrive. Instead, he began presenting the railway as the answer to the trade war rather than one of its victims. His message to Canadian and Mexican businesses was simple and deliberate. They did not have to depend on American ports. They did not have to rely on American customs systems. Freight could move from Calgary, pass through Kansas City, and continue directly into Mexico City. The route still crossed American territory, and Kansas City remained the point where the former Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern systems connected. But the strategic change was not about avoiding American geography. It was about creating a direct commercial corridor between Canada and Mexico. Before the merger, trade between Canada and Mexico remained surprisingly limited, especially considering the agreements connecting the 2 countries. Both nations belonged to QESMA, previously known as NAFTA, and both also participated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Despite those agreements, total Canada-Mexico trade reached only about 56 billion Canadian dollars in 2024. By comparison, trade between Canada and the United States exceeded $700 billion every year. That enormous gap represented an opportunity, and CPKC was positioned to close part of it through rail. Only weeks after the merger was completed, CPKC introduced the Mexico Midwest Express in May 2023. The premium intermodal service connected Chicago and Kansas City directly with Monterrey and San Luis Potosi. It was the first clear indication of what the new freight network could become. Mexico was also investing heavily in its own rail infrastructure. One of the most important projects was the interoceanic corridor of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, known as the CIIT. The 188-mile route connects Mexico's Pacific and Atlantic coasts across the southern part of the country. CPKC agreed to study how its network could connect with the CIIT project. That analysis was delivered to the Mexican government as part of infrastructure planning for the period between 2024 and 2030. This is how two countries begin reshaping a continental trade system without making dramatic declarations. There was no major press conference and no theatrical announcement. There were feasibility studies, investment plans, and infrastructure commitments. Then, in December 2024, CPKC finished building a second international rail bridge at Laredo. The Patrick J. Ottensmeyer International Railway Bridge officially opened on February 6, 2025, immediately doubling rail crossing capacity between Laredo, Texas, and Nuevo Laredo. Mexico, CPKC had already invested more than $75 million in additional sidings and double-track sections across Mexico. That spending had not been part of the original merger budget. It was added because freight demand was increasing faster than the company had initially forecast. At the same time, CPKC was developing the port of Lázaro Cárdenas as another strategic option. For years, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach had struggled with chronic congestion. Lázaro Cárdenas offered a Pacific gateway capable of avoiding those bottlenecks entirely. Containers arriving from Asia could be unloaded in Mexico, placed directly onto CPKC trains, and moved into Canadian distribution networks without entering an American port, going through US customs clearance, or paying American terminal charges. That is not a conspiracy theory, it is a logistics strategy capable of saving shippers billions of dollars over time. As American tariffs intensified during the opening months of 2025, that route suddenly became far more attractive. Analysts at Veritas Investment Research maintained a buy rating on CPKC during this period. Analyst Will Guy pointed specifically to the flexibility of the railway's network as its strongest advantage over competing carriers. CPKC had access to multiple ports, several major corridors, and 3 national markets. No other freight operator in North America could offer the same range of options. By the time the 25% American steel tariffs took effect on March 4, 2025, CPKC was already prepared. Canada introduced counter-tariffs covering $30 billion in American goods on the same day. The trade conflict had moved into full force. Supply chains were being reconsidered, and executives across the continent were trying to understand how exposed their companies had become. Inside CPKC's Calgary headquarters, however, the focus was not only on risk. The company was calculating where new business could emerge. Every shipper searching for an alternative to traditional American routes had suddenly become a potential customer. The first clear sign that the system was beginning to change came from a train carrying oats. A grain processor in Saskatchewan loaded its shipment onto CPKC railcars and sent it south. The destination was not Chicago, Minneapolis, or any other American city. The train traveled roughly 4,800 kilometers through the United States without unloading its cargo once. There was no American customs clearance, no exposure to US import tariffs, and no American freight terminal handling the shipment. The train continued directly into Mexico as the first single-line oat service of its kind. This was not really a story about grain. It was evidence that the structure of continental trade was quietly being redesigned. Canadian oat exports to Mexico had averaged around $29 million annually during the previous 5 years. After CPKC introduced its direct bonded service in early 2025, those volumes nearly increased fourfold. The word bonded is what makes the entire strategy work. A bonded shipment can move through a country without being formally imported into that country. The cargo is sealed, the documentation is submitted in advance, and the train continues across the territory without the goods entering the domestic customs system. CPKC began offering that kind of service between Canada and Mexico in early 2025. Goods could leave Calgary, travel through the United States inside sealed and pre-documented containers, and arrive in Mexico City, Monterrey, or San Luis Potosi without undergoing a normal US import inspection. There was no direct tariff exposure, no standard customs delay, and no need to unload at an American terminal. Because the freight was only passing through the United States, Washington had far less control over the commercial transaction itself. Just as important, CPKC controlled the entire railway from beginning to end. The shipment did not need to be transferred to another carrier at any point. That single-line advantage is essential to understanding the speed and cost savings built into the network. Railway economics follow a simple rule. Every additional handling increases the cost. Each time a rail car is transferred between companies, the shipment loses time and creates more paperwork, liability, and operational expense. Older Canada to Mexico routes relied on several carriers, which meant repeated interchanges during the journey. CPKC removed those transfers from the Calgary to Mexico City route. One company handled the train. One manifest followed the shipment. One set of locomotives moved the freight, and one customs file covered the journey from its origin to its final destination. That is why Keith Creel described the system to investors as a land bridge across North America. "We've become a land bridge across America," Creel said, and the phrase accurately described what the railway had built. The range of products moving across that bridge expanded quickly during 2025. Canadian shipments traveling south included oats, wheat, canola oil, specialty crops, liquefied petroleum gas, refined fuel, and plastics. One train carrying Canada Western Red Spring wheat harvested in Manitoba traveled almost 3,200 miles to Mexico City using CPKC tracks. It completed the trip without transfers, unnecessary delays, or interruptions from another railway. Freight moving north from Mexico included fresh fruit, vegetables, appliances, furniture, and manufactured products. Loblaw, one of Canada's largest grocery retailers, was among the first major companies to publicly support the shift. Chief Executive Per Bank announced through social media that the company would look for Mexican alternatives to products it had previously purchased from the United States. Mexico had become a more attractive supplier because Canada's retaliatory tariffs had increased the cost of American goods. Mexican products were now comparatively less expensive, and CPKC could transport them directly into Canadian distribution centers. This was the financial logic that few people in Washington wanted to discuss openly. Every Canadian tariff placed on an American product improved the relative position of Mexican suppliers. Every additional US tariff imposed on Canadian exports made Mexico more appealing as an alternative destination for Canadian businesses. The trade war was not destroying CPKC's business model. It was proving the model worked and pushing customers toward it faster. Direct traffic between Canada and Mexico represented only about 2% of CPKC's total revenue in 2024. By the beginning of 2026, that share had already moved above 3% and was continuing to rise. 3% of almost $14.8 billion in annual freight revenue represented meaningful business, and the corridor was still developing. At an investor conference in March 2026, Creel placed special emphasis on the Canada-Mexico route. He described it as one of the fastest-growing parts of the CPKC network when measured by percentage growth. At the same time, the company was developing another major route in cooperation with CSX Transportation. The Southeast Mexico Express, known as SMX, linked Atlanta with destinations across Mexico. Upgrades to a former shortline railway in Alabama allowed trains to operate at speeds of up to 49 miles per hour along the route. Freight could travel from Atlanta to Monterrey in approximately 3 days and reach central Mexico in around 4. Those transit times were competitive with trucking while remaining significantly less expensive for companies moving large volumes of goods. CPKC also formed a partnership with Americold, the world's largest operator of temperature-controlled warehouses, to expand refrigerated freight services. A cold storage facility opened beside the Kansas City Intermodal Terminal, providing direct support for customers shipping perishable and temperature-sensitive cargo. Related facilities were operating in Mexico and in St. John, New Brunswick. Together, they created a cold chain network capable of moving refrigerated products across all 3 countries. Mexican avocados, Canadian canola oil, dairy products, and pharmaceutical components could move through the continent inside temperature-controlled containers. This type of integrated logistics system cannot be created in a few months. It requires years of planning, construction, regulatory work, and coordination. CPKC had been building these capabilities quarter by quarter since the merger was completed in April 2023. When the tariff conflict erupted in 2025, the network was already operating. That preparation gave Creel's land bridge argument real credibility with companies urgently looking for alternatives. The physical infrastructure already existed. The customs procedures had already been approved. The locomotives, rail cars, terminals and staff were already in place. The company had also established a post-merger target that showed how ambitious the strategy was. CPKC wanted to shift 64,000 truckloads from highways onto rail every year. By early 2026, it had reached about 40% of that objective, moving approximately 25,000 truckloads from road transport to the railway. Progress had been slower than originally expected, because excess trucking capacity kept freight rates unusually low. But those conditions were beginning to change as higher diesel prices, driver shortages, and regulatory costs reduced the financial advantage of long-distance trucking. For corporate finance departments, the lower structural cost of rail over long distances was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The 25% tariff on American steel placed Canadian manufacturers under intense pressure. Their margins were being squeezed, and many were suddenly looking for suppliers anywhere outside the United States. Mexico had steel production. Mexico had manufacturing capacity, and CPKC had the railway needed to connect those suppliers directly with Canadian buyers. At that point, trade between Canada and Mexico was still dramatically underdeveloped compared with the scale of their economic potential. Former Canadian Ambassador Shauna Hemingway described the situation in simple terms. Both countries were often selling similar products to China instead of trading more with one another. Canada and Mexico each exported fertilizer, machinery, and industrial goods to Chinese buyers even though they could have been doing more business directly across North America. That overlap represented a largely unused opportunity worth billions of dollars each year, provided the trade could be efficiently moved by rail. The corridor was not simply a reaction to the tariff conflict. It was also a correction to an oversight that had lasted for decades. Canada and Mexico shared free trade agreements, yet meaningful bilateral commerce between them remained relatively limited because the American market sat between them. The United States was too close, too large, and too convenient to ignore. Its economic gravity kept both countries focused on Washington rather than on each other. The trade war disrupted that pull. Whether the change would be temporary or permanent was still unclear, but businesses were beginning to reconsider where products should be sourced, manufactured, and shipped. Foreign investors were also watching the conflict carefully, with billions of dollars in planned manufacturing projects delayed, while companies waited for greater policy certainty. Mexico's Business Coordinating Council projected that the country could attract around $43 billion in foreign direct investment during 2025. A similar total of between $40 billion and $45 billion was expected again in 2026. During the first half of 2025, foreign investment into Mexico increased by more than 10% compared with the previous year. Manufacturing received approximately 36% of that capital, making it the largest destination for investment by a significant margin. Transportation equipment alone accounted for nearly half of all new manufacturing investment entering the country. Money was flowing into auto parts, electric vehicle components, heavy machinery, and other industrial production. Much of the output from those factories would eventually move by rail. Every new plant built close to a CPKC route created the potential for permanent freight volume across the network. This is why Keith Creel was doing more than operating a railway. He was helping build an industrial ecosystem around it. CPKC introduced a site-ready industrial development program designed to speed up investment decisions. Underused land located along the network was prepared in advance as approved industrial property with direct rail access. A manufacturer could establish a factory and connect to the railway from the first day of operations. The company would not need to begin a separate round of negotiations for rail infrastructure after choosing the site. The program was created to remove one of the most common obstacles slowing nearshoring projects: the delay caused by missing infrastructure. For manufacturers comparing possible locations, The time required to secure rail connections, permits, and customs arrangements often becomes the deciding factor. CPKC attempted to eliminate that friction by offering prepared sites, installed rail access, and established cross-border procedures. That transformed the corridor from a transportation route into a magnet for industrial development. At the same time, the Southeast Mexico Express was beginning to produce results that answered many of the remaining doubts about the network. CSX and CPKC officially introduced the upgraded SMX service in May 2026. The improvements reduced travel time between Atlanta and Dallas by a full day. Between Atlanta and central Mexico, the reduction reached approximately 2.12 days. Depending on the destination, that represented an improvement of roughly 20 to 45% on a commercially important freight corridor. A single train operating on the route could replace as many as 300 tractor-trailers traveling on crowded American highways. Removing 300 trucks with one train was not only a logistical improvement, it also had a major environmental impact. CPKC said its rails have produced approximately 75% fewer greenhouse gas emissions than heavy road freight. A locomotive could move 1 ton of cargo around 500 miles using a single gallon of diesel fuel. No heavy truck could come close to matching that basic level of efficiency. As environmental reporting rules became stricter, and companies faced greater pressure to account for carbon emissions, those numbers became increasingly important. Finance executives approving freight contracts in 2025 and 2026 were no longer considering transportation prices alone. They were also calculating emissions exposure and the future cost of carbon regulation. Rail was not only becoming more competitive on price, it was also becoming easier to justify from a compliance perspective. The company's financial performance reflected the growing strength of the network. CPKC reported full-year revenue of approximately $15.1 billion in 2025, an increase of about 4% from $14.5 billion in 2024. It also achieved a record core adjusted operating ratio of 59.9% for the full year. That improvement showed that the railway was becoming more efficient even while total revenue continued to grow. Core adjusted diluted earnings per share increased by 8%, rising from 4.25 cents in 2024 to 4.61 cents in 2025. During the fourth quarter of 2025, CPKC recorded its best quarterly operating ratio ever at 55.9%. Train weights reached new highs. Network speeds set a record. Locomotive productivity improved, and the number of miles traveled per railcar per day also reached a new peak. All 4 major operational measurements set records during the same quarter. That was not simply a benefit of geography. It was the result of execution. Mexico's freight market was growing at approximately 16.4% in 2026, considerably faster than the wider market. CPKC was positioned to capture a major share of that expansion because no competitor had the same continuous network, and the company still believed it was only beginning to unlock the railway's full potential. Management had established a goal of producing $1.2 billion in annual merger synergies by 2027. Approximately 60% of those gains were expected to come from lower operating costs. The remaining 40% was expected to come from new revenue opportunities created by the combined railway. CPKC committed close to $2.8 billion in capital spending during 2025 to increase capacity and strengthen its infrastructure. Every dollar invested in the network made it more difficult for competitors to reproduce the same service. The single-line advantage alone reduced shipment times by approximately 24 to 48 hours, compared with routes requiring multiple railway companies. In freight transportation, a difference of 2 days can determine whether a company wins a customer or loses that business permanently. The operating philosophy supporting these results was precision-scheduled railroading, a system inherited from Canadian Pacific. The principle is straightforward: eliminate unnecessary movements, reduce idle equipment, and avoid stops that do not contribute to the shipment. Every railcar is assigned a defined schedule and destination. That discipline helped transform Canadian Pacific from a struggling railway into one of the most profitable operators in North America. When the same model is applied across a 20,000-mile international network, the financial benefit grows with every additional route and customer. Now, step back from the company's financial results And look at what this railway represents on the map. A company headquartered in Calgary controls the only continuous rail network linking Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It carries Canadian grain south to Mexican processors and brings Mexican produce north into Canadian grocery distribution centers, without breaking the journey between competing railways. It also moves Asian cargo arriving at the port of Lázaro Cárdenas directly toward major inland markets.